It's a common feeling, the uneasy sensation that someone is watching you when you're alone, that cold chill creeping up your spine, the hairs on the back of your neck standing on end. Sometimes it's nothing, a trick of the mind perhaps, but other times it's something far worse, something you can't see, but know is there lurking in the darkness. Tonight, I want to share with you the story of one such haunting, something that made a man sleep with one eye open for the rest of his life, something that refused to let go, no matter how far he ran or how tightly he shut his eyes at night. Jason had always been a rational man, the type to dismiss things that couldn't be explained. He scoffed at stories of ghosts, the supernatural, and anything that hinted at the unknown. But one quiet evening, that all changed. It began like any other night. Jason was alone in his apartment. The faint hum of the refrigerator, the only sound breaking the silence. He just finished his work and decided to relax with a book, sipping on his lukewarm coffee. The city outside his window buzzed with life, the distant murmur of traffic and the occasional siren keeping him grounded. But there was something off that night, something he couldn't quite place. It started with a sound, a creaking, soft at first, almost imperceptible, like someone walking on an old wooden floor. Jason froze, the hairs on the back of his neck rising. He'd been hearing things like this all week. The neighbors above him had been renovating their apartment, and the noise was often unsettling. But this was different. It wasn't the sound of someone moving furniture. It was slower, more deliberate. He shook it off, returning to his book, but the sound persisted. Creak, 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 closer and closer. Jason felt his pulse quicken, his eyes darting nervously around the room. The creaking had moved from above to behind him. The apartment was small, and he was sitting by the window with his back to the door. But surely no one was there, right? He stood up, the creaking stopping abruptly as his feet hit the floor. He checked the kitchen, then the bathroom, but saw nothing out of the ordinary. His mind was playing tricks on him, he thought. The silence now seemed heavier than before, as though the air itself was thick with something unspoken. Then it happened. A faint tapping sound, like a finger on glass, echoed from the window behind him. Jason's breath caught in his throat. The tapping didn't stop. It grew more insistent, faster, as if whoever was on the other side was trying to get his attention. Slowly, he turned, his heart pounding in his chest. Outside the window, standing in the shadows of the fire escape, was a figure. He couldn't make out the details, but he could feel its presence, dark, oppressive, and watching. For a moment, Jason just stood there, frozen. His mind scrambled for an explanation, but there was none. The figure didn't move. It didn't speak. It just stared, the darkness cloaking its features. Then, as if on cue, the figure slowly raised its hand and placed it against the glass. Jason's blood ran cold. He could see the outline of the hand, pale and long-fingered, pressing against the window as if it were trying to reach him. He wanted to run. He wanted to scream, but his body refused to obey. The tapping continued, louder now, as if mocking his terror. Jason forced himself to step back, retreating to the opposite side of the room, but his eyes remained locked on the figure. And just as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure vanished into the night, dissolving into the shadows like smoke in the wind. But the fear didn't leave him. He rushed to check the locks on the windows, but they were secure. He made sure the door was locked. He even checked the hallway outside, but nothing. No sign of anyone. For the rest of the night, Jason couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The tapping persisted, though it grew quieter, like a distant memory he couldn't erase. That night, when he finally fell asleep, his dreams were filled with the figure. Its pale hand pressed against his window, its eyes, dark and empty, staring into his soul. He woke up several times, drenched in sweat, and each time the sense of dread followed him like a shadow. The next day, Jason tried to tell himself it was just a bad dream. His rational mind fought back, but something in the pit of his stomach told him otherwise. He couldn't explain what had happened, and he couldn't shake the feeling that the figure was still out there, watching him from the shadows. For the first time in his life, he couldn't sleep with both eyes closed. Every night, he kept one eye open, waiting for the tapping to return, for the figure to reappear. And reappear it did, But Jason would soon learn that the figure wasn't just a fleeting nightmare. It had come for him. It wasn't a dream or a trick of the mind. It was real. But who or what was it? The human mind is a curious thing. It can rationalize away almost anything. A strange noise? Probably just the wind. A fleeting shadow in the corner of your eye? Likely just a trick of the light. But what happens when your mind can no longer deny what it's seeing? When a thing that shouldn't exist is staring back at you with dark, empty eyes? For Jason, that moment came when he realized that the figure from the night before wasn't a one-time thing. It wasn't a dream. It was something far more real and far more terrifying. It had been a week since Jason's first encounter with the figure at his window. He had tried everything to rationalize it. Maybe it was a prank, someone playing a sick joke. Maybe he had seen a shadow cast by the fire escape, his mind making it into something far worse than it truly was. But deep down, Jason knew it was more than that. He felt it in the pit of his stomach, that unshakable sensation that something was watching him. And worse, it was getting closer. Each night, Jason would lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, keeping one eye open, as he had promised himself. He had heard the tapping again, faint at first, like the lightest knock on a door. The first few nights, he chalked it up to his mind playing tricks on him, but soon the tapping grew louder, more insistent. By the end of the week, it was as though the figure were right outside his window again, waiting, watching just out of sight. And then came the night it happened again. Jason had been reading late into the evening, his tired eyes struggling to focus on the words. The room was dim, only the soft glow of a desk lamp cutting through the darkness. The quiet hum of the city outside was a constant, but Jason had learned to tune it out over time. It was a familiar sound, one that should have been comforting. But tonight, it felt different. It felt wrong. A sudden crack broke the silence, coming from somewhere deep within the apartment. Jason jumped, his heart pounding in his chest. He stood up, his eyes scanning the room. Was it the pipes again? No, this was something else. He moved to the kitchen, his footsteps echoing on the wooden floor. But there was nothing there, just the empty space he'd come to know too well. But then he heard it, a light tap, then another, and another. This wasn't the gentle tapping from before. This was deliberate, as if someone was trying to get his attention. His pulse quickened as the sound moved, closer, then farther away, then closer again. Jason froze. He knew that sound. It was coming from behind him, from the direction of the bedroom. His blood ran cold, and for a split second, he considered bolting out of the apartment. But something kept him rooted to the spot, something darker than fear. Then he heard the whisper. It was soft at first, so faint he thought he might have imagined it. But no, it came again, this time clearer, more distinct. Jason? The sound was barely audible, but it cut through the stillness of the night like a knife. It was so familiar, so close. The whisper had his name, and for the first time, Jason's mind snapped into full awareness. It wasn't his imagination. His heart thudded in his chest as he turned toward the bedroom, slowly stepping into the dark hallway. The whispers continued, growing louder, until the last one echoed in his ears. Jason were waiting. He felt a chill wash over him as he reached the doorway to his bedroom. The door jarred just enough for him to see a sliver of the darkness inside. He hesitated for a moment, his mind racing. Every instinct told him to run, to leave the apartment and never look back. But curiosity and fear kept him moving forward. Jason pushed the door open, the old wood creaking in protest. The room was completely still, the air heavy with an unsettling silence. Then he saw it, a figure standing at the far corner of the room, almost blending into the shadows. He could just make out the outline, a tall, thin silhouette. The figure stood motionless, as if waiting. The same feeling from the night it first appeared flooded over him, like being caught in the presence of something ancient, something that shouldn't be. Jason's breath caught in his throat. He wanted to speak, to demand what this thing wanted, but his mouth went dry. He could hardly move, his legs feeling like lead. The figure didn't move either. It just stood there, watching. Then it raised a hand, that same long-fingered hand Jason had seen pressed against the window just days ago. It came closer, Slowly, deliberately, Jason's legs finally gave way, and he stumbled back, his foot catching on the edge of the bed. The figure took another step forward, and Jason stumbled backward even further, his heart now hammering in his chest. "Who are you?" Jason finally managed to choke out, his voice trembling. "What do you want from me?" The figure tilted its head, its eyes still hidden in shadow. It was as if it hadn't heard him, or perhaps it didn't need to respond. The silence grew unbearable, the weight of the moment heavy in the air. Jason felt as though the room was closing in on him, as though he was suffocating. And then, as if it had been waiting for this moment, the figure spoke, but its voice was not the soft whisper Jason had heard before. No, this time it was louder, clearer, and chilling beyond comprehension. "You're never truly alone, Jason." Jason's eyes widened, his breast shallow, his mind unable to process what he had just heard. "Never truly alone?" The figure stepped forward once more, its shadow growing larger as it closed the gap. But just as suddenly as it had appeared, it vanished into thin air, leaving only the oppressive darkness in its wake. Jason stood in the middle of the room, shaking uncontrollably, his mind reeling. He rushed to check the apartment, searching for any sign of the figure, but there was nothing, no trace, nothing but the echo of the words that had been spoken. "You're never truly alone." Jason's sense of safety had crumbled completely. He couldn't explain what was happening to him, but one thing was clear. The figure wasn't going away. It wasn't a nightmare. It wasn't a trick of the light. It was real. That night, Jason couldn't sleep. He lay awake in his bed, eyes darting around the room, his mind trapped in an endless loop of dread. The sound of tapping started again, faint at first, then growing louder and faster. It was a sound that would never let him rest, a sound that would stay with him for the rest of his life. Jason's life had changed forever. No matter how far he ran, no matter how many lights he turned on, the figure would always be there, waiting, watching. The whispers grew louder each night, the tapping incessant. His world had become a nightmare, and he had no escape. But perhaps the most terrifying part of all was that Jason had learned the truth. The figure wasn't just haunting him. It was a part of him now, a shadow that would never let go. And Jason would spend the rest of his days terrified to sleep with both eyes closed, knowing that when the tapping began, the figure was closer than ever. There are things in this world that simply cannot be explained, things that defy logic and reason. At first, we deny them. We convince ourselves they are just tricks of the mind, our imagination spinning tales to fill the void of the unknown. But there comes a point when you can no longer ignore the truth, when the terror becomes so real, so tangible, that even the strongest of wills can no longer deny it. For Jason, that point had arrived. The figure was no longer a mere shadow at his window or a fleeting image in the corner of his vision. It was something far worse, something that had begun to invade his every thought, his every waking moment. And now, he was about to learn the chilling truth behind the figure's endless pursuit. Jason spent the next few days in a haze of fear. His mind was a constant whirlpool of terror, and sleep had become a distant memory. He couldn't even stay in his apartment without feeling like the walls themselves were closing in on him. Every creak, every groan of the building sent his heart racing. Every shadow seemed to hide something, something that was always watching, always waiting. But despite the overwhelming dread, Jason refused to leave. His pride, or perhaps his desperation to understand what was happening to him, kept him rooted in the place that had become his prison. It was only when he could no longer deny the truth that he decided to take action. Jason had tried everything, talking to friends, even seeking the advice of therapists, but no one could offer an explanation. The figure was real, and it wasn't going away. So Jason turned to the only source that might have answers, the old library in town, where forgotten books on the occult and the supernatural sat gathering dust. The musty air of the library hit him as soon as he stepped inside. Shelves creaked under the weight of ancient volumes, and the dim light made the place feel like something out of a forgotten horror story. Jason's footsteps echoed through the silence as he walked down the narrow aisles, his fingers brushing against the spines of books that seemed to beckon him closer. It was in the back corner of the library, buried under a pile of discarded papers, that Jason found it. A dusty old book with no title on the cover. He opened it carefully, the yellowed pages creaking under his touch, and immediately his eyes were drawn to a passage that seemed to call to him. The text described an entity, something ancient and malevolent that thrived on fear and despair. It was called the Watcher, a creature that preyed on the souls of those who were too consumed by their own dread. It was a being that existed in the shadows, feeding on the terror of its victims. The more they feared it, the stronger it became. The word sent a shiver down Jason's spine. The description fit everything he had experienced perfectly. The tapping, the whispers, the dark figure that watched him from the corners of his apartment. It was no longer a mere haunting. It was a curse. The book continued to describe how the Watcher chose its victims, not by accident but by design. It sought out those who were vulnerable, those whose lives were filled with doubt and fear. Once it attached itself to someone, it would never let go. The victim would become consumed by the terror, their every moment plagued by the entity's presence, until the inevitable conclusion, death. Jason slammed the book shut, his hands shaking. He had read enough. The figure wasn't just haunting him. It was feeding on his fear, getting stronger with every passing day. And there was no way out. He couldn't run. The Watcher had already marked him. But there was more. A small section in the back of the book described something even more horrifying. It spoke of a ritual, a way to sever the bond between a Watcher and his victim. But it came with a heavy price. The ritual would require the victim to confront their greatest fear, the source of their terror, and face it head-on. Only by doing so could the entity be banished. Jason's mind raced. What was his greatest fear? The Watcher had already taken everything from him. His peace of mind, his ability to sleep, his sense of safety. But the book didn't offer a simple answer. It didn't tell him what he needed to confront. It only hinted at the darkness within. Jason's heart sank as he began to piece it together. The Watcher was more than just a creature from the shadows. It was a reflection of his own inner demons. It was a manifestation of his deepest, most hidden fears. Jason left the library with the book clutched tightly in his hands, his mind swirling with questions. Could he really face his fear? Could he really confront the darkness inside himself? The Watcher wasn't just an external force. It was part of him. It had always been there, waiting for the moment when his own fears would grow too great to ignore. As he walked back to his apartment, the weight of a decision pressed heavily on his chest. The tapping sound had started again, faint and distant, like a quiet drumbeat in the back of his mind. The whispers followed him down the street, like a distant, mocking voice that wouldn't let him forget. When Jason returned to his apartment, he knew the time had come. The Watcher was waiting for him. It had been waiting all along. And now, the true horror would begin. In the next part of this twisted tale, Jason must face the terror within himself, the fear that has been feeding the Watcher all along, and discover the price of survival. There are some fears we try to outrun, some nightmares we try to hide from, and others that we try to bury deep within ourselves. But no matter how far we run, no matter how many doors we lock or lights we turn on, some fears refuse to stay hidden. They follow us. They grow stronger. And when the time comes to face them, we are forced to confront the darkness within. Jason had learned this truth the hard way. The Watcher, the thing that had haunted him for weeks, wasn't just an external monster. It was a manifestation of his deepest fear, a reflection of his own tortured soul. And now, he had no choice but to confront it. Jason spent the entire night reading the book he had found in the library, obsessing over the ritual it described. The words blurred together as he tried to process the gravity of what he had learned. The ritual was simple in theory. Confront your greatest fear, face it head-on, and the Watcher will be banished. But the more he thought about it, the more he realized how impossible that task was. How could he possibly face the thing that terrified him the most? How could he stare into the abyss of his own soul and survive it? The Watcher wasn't just some vague fear. It wasn't an unknown entity lurking outside his window or tapping on his door. No, it was a physical, unyielding presence, one that seemed to reach into his very being. It had come for him because he was vulnerable, because he had spent his life running from his own inner demons. Jason couldn't help but think back to his childhood, the moments he had buried so deep that even now they felt like a foreign memory. Growing up, He had been terrified of the dark, of the unknown. But there was something more, something darker. It was a fear that had taken root in him at an early age, a fear that had never really gone away. Jason's father had been an unpredictable, often violent man, someone who had instilled in him a deep sense of dread long before the figure had begun to haunt his nights. The scars from his childhood were not physical but psychological, deep wounds that never healed. He had learned to hide from the pain, to lock it away in the darkest corners of his mind. But the Watcher had found it. It had found the fear he thought he could control, the fear he had never confronted. That was the key. The Watcher wasn't just feeding on his terror. It was feeding on the unresolved trauma from his past. He realized then that the entity was a physical manifestation of his own repressed memories, his own darkest emotions. It had grown powerful because Jason had refused to confront it. And now he had no choice. The ritual was simple, but Jason knew the price would be high. He had read that it required a complete reckoning, an acceptance of what had been buried. Only then would the Watcher be banished. Jason wasn't sure what would happen if he failed. The book didn't say. It only warned that the longer one resisted the ritual, the stronger the Watcher became, and the more impossible it would be to escape its grip. He had no time left. Jason stood in front of his bedroom mirror, looking at his reflection. He had never truly seen himself, never acknowledged the person he had become. But tonight, that would change. As he stared at his own eyes in the mirror, he spoke aloud to the empty room, "I'm ready." And with that, the room seemed to change. The air grew thicker, and the shadows on the walls deepened. Jason's breath caught in his throat as he heard the familiar tapping again. But this time, it wasn't just tapping. It was scratching, scraping, a clawing sound, as if something was trying to claw its way into his very being. He turned slowly toward the door, and in that moment, everything fell silent. A shape began to form in the darkness. The figure emerged from the shadows, its pale hand pressed against the wall, its long, thin fingers curling as it stepped closer. Jason could feel the temperature drop, the air growing colder with every inch the figure came forward. Jason's heart raced. He could hear the whispers, louder now, like a chorus of voices speaking directly into his ear. His entire body trembled as he watched the figure move with a slow, deliberate pace, as though it was savoring his fear. The Watcher was here, but this time Jason was not running. With a steadying breath, Jason stepped toward the figure. "I know what you are," he said, his voice hoarse but resolute. "I know what you've been feeding on. You are my fear. You are my pain. But I'm not afraid of you anymore." The figure stopped, its head tilting in that eerie, unnatural way. The whispers grew louder, almost deafening now. Jason could feel the suffocating presence of the Watcher pushing into him, trying to break him. But he stood firm. He had to confront this. He had to face it, even if it meant facing the worst parts of himself. "I'm not running," he said again, louder this time. "I won't let you win." The room seemed to pulse with the Watcher's power, the shadows stretching unnaturally. But Jason didn't flinch. Instead, he closed his eyes and began to recall the darkest moments of his life. His father's harsh words, the night spent in fear of the man who should have protected him, the helplessness, the anger, the sadness. He let it all in, every painful memory he had tried to forget, every hurtful word, every lost moment. The darkness in the room began to swirl, the air thick with tension. The Watcher seemed to grow agitated, its form flickering, as if it were struggling to maintain its shape. It shrieked, a sound so agonizing it made Jason's skin crawl. But he didn't look away. "I am not my fear," Jason said, his voice strong despite the chaos around him, "and I will not be controlled by it." Suddenly, the figure lunged forward, but this time Jason wasn't afraid. He stood his ground, his eyes still closed, facing the terror head-on. The room seemed to implode in on itself, the shadows twisting, the whispers merging into one deafening roar. And then there was silence. Jason opened his eyes. The room was empty. The shadows were gone. The figure had disappeared, leaving nothing behind but a feeling of overwhelming stillness. He was alone, but the fear wasn't gone. Not completely. Jason knew that facing his greatest fear didn't mean it was over. It meant accepting that it would always be a part of him. The Watcher hadn't been banished. It had merely been transformed. The terror was now something he had learned to live with, to control. Jason took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the darkness lift. Even if just a little, he had faced his demons. He had faced the Watcher. And in doing so, he had learned the most terrifying lesson of all. Sometimes, the thing we fear most isn't something out there in the shadows. It's the darkness within us. As Jason stood in the center of his room, the silence around him felt almost unnatural. For the first time in weeks, he could breathe. The figure was gone, and yet Jason knew it wasn't truly gone. It would never be gone. It would always be a part of him, lurking in the darkest corners of his mind. But he had won. The Watcher had been fed, had grown stronger. But in the end, it was Jason who had taken control. The terror that once consumed him now seemed more manageable, something he could live with, something that would never have the power to control him again. As Jason laid down that night, for the first time in what felt like an eternity, he finally closed both eyes. But even with the terror at bay, a small part of him wondered if he would ever truly sleep soundly again. In the final chapter, we'll discover what happens when Jason's past isn't fully behind him, and what happens when the Watcher returns in a new form, more powerful than before. This chapter pushes Jason closer to his psychological reckoning, building the tension as he faces the internal source of his terror. The Watcher is no longer just an external figure. It represents Jason's own trauma. The ritual to confront fear provides a powerful emotional climax, creating a layered, psychological horror that culminates in both a personal victory and an unsettling realization. The journey to face his deepest fear leaves the audience with lingering questions about what truly haunts Jason, and whether his victory is as permanent as he hopes. There are some battles that we believe we have won, only to discover, too late, that the victory was never truly ours. Sometimes, the darkness we thought we had conquered only waits in the shadows, gathering strength, biding its time until we let our guard down. For Jason, the nightmare had never truly ended. The Watcher had not been vanquished. It had merely taken a new form, one more insidious and more dangerous than before. It had bided its time, waiting for Jason to believe he was safe. But now the time had come, and Jason was about to learn a terrible truth. The Watcher never truly leaves. It had been 2 weeks since Jason had confronted the Watcher, 2 weeks since he had allowed himself to breathe again. He had begun to feel like a normal person once more, sleeping through the night, walking through his apartment without the nagging sense that something was lurking in the corners of his vision. The whispers had stopped. The tapping had ceased. The figure had vanished. Or so Jason thought. It was a quiet Tuesday evening when the first sign appeared. Jason had just finished dinner and was about to settle down to watch some TV when he noticed something strange. His apartment had always been meticulously clean, and yet now a fine layer of dust seemed to have settled over the surfaces. At first, he chalked it up to the usual wear and tear of city life. But then he saw it. On the kitchen counter, in the dust, was a single handprint. It wasn't his. It wasn't anyone's. Jason's heart skipped a beat. He wiped it away hastily, looking around the room. No one had been here. No one could have touched the counter. And yet, the print was unmistakable. He shook his head. It couldn't be happening again. He had faced the Watcher. He had confronted his darkest fears. It had to be over. But deep down, he knew something far worse was coming. That night, the tapping began again. At first, it was soft just like before, light and rhythmic, almost like a heartbeat echoing through the walls. But this time, Jason didn't hesitate. He knew it wasn't just a wind, wasn't just a trick of the light. The Watcher was back. It was waiting for him. Jason stayed in bed, his eyes wide open in the darkness. His hands were clenched into fists by his sides, but his body was frozen. The tapping was louder now, closer. It was coming from the window. The wind picked up and the glass rattled. He could feel his pulse pounding in his ears, but he refused to move. He wouldn't give in this time. He had faced the Watcher and survived. But then he heard it, a whisper, soft but unmistakable. Jason, he snapped his eyes open, staring at the window. The room was still dark, but for the first time, he thought he saw something moving in the shadows outside. A figure, a silhouette, standing just beyond the glass. Jason's breath caught in his throat. It was happening again. The Watcher had returned. Suddenly, the tapping grew faster, louder, until it was like a storm battering the window. His heart raced. He scrambled out of bed, his legs unsteady beneath him, and rushed to the window. There was nothing there. Jason stared out into the night, the lights of the city flickering in the distance, but no figure, no shadow. He let out a breath he didn't realize he had been holding, but the relief was short-lived. Something was off. The air felt wrong. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up as a cold chill swept through the room. And then he saw it in the reflection of the glass. Just over his shoulder, a figure emerged. Jason whipped around, but the room was empty. He spun back to the window, and there it was again, the figure standing behind him in the reflection. This time, its features were clearer, and Jason's blood ran cold. It wasn't the same as before. The figure looked different, darker, its face twisted in a grotesque mask with distorted features. "You didn't think you could get rid of me that easily, did you?" The voice was low, distorted, like an echo in a cave, but it was unmistakable. It was the voice of the Watcher. Jason stumbled back, his mind racing. The Watcher had returned, but this time it wasn't just watching from the shadows. This time, it had found a way into the very fabric of his reality. It had crossed the boundary between the physical and the psychological. He couldn't escape it. It wasn't just lurking in his apartment. It was in his mind. It had followed him into his thoughts. His head began to spin as the figure in the reflection grinned, a twisted, mocking smile stretching across its face. "You thought you could outrun me." The Watcher's voice echoed, the words scraping against the psyche. "You thought you could face your fear. But you're not free of me, Jason. You never were." Jason's breath quickened as his vision blurred. He staggered back, reaching out for something to steady himself, but there was nothing. The room began to distort around him, warping, twisting as if reality itself was unraveling. The Watcher was in control now. Jason stumbled to the door, his hands trembling as he fumbled with the lock, but it wouldn't budge. The darkness was closing in, the shadows creeping across the walls, the room filling with the sound of the Watcher's distorted whispers. "Sleep with one eye open, Jason." The voice echoed louder, becoming a scream in his ears. "You can't escape me. You never could." The shadows closing on him, wrapping around him like a suffocating blanket. The figure in the reflection smiled wider, and Jason finally understood. The Watcher was not just a creature of fear. It was a part of him. It had always been a part of him. Jason collapsed to the floor, his mind unraveling as the darkness consumed him. Jason had thought he could escape the grip of the Watcher. He had thought that by confronting his fears, he could free himself from its endless pursuit. But he was wrong. The Watcher never truly left. It had only been lying in wait, patiently watching until the moment Jason's guard was down. Now Jason understood. The Watcher wasn't just an external force. It was a reflection of his own darkest thoughts, his deepest fears. It was a part of him that would never go away. As the shadows closed in around him, Jason realized that the true horror wasn't just in the Watcher. It was in the realization that he would always be its prey, and that, no matter how hard he tried to escape, he would always be forced to sleep with one eye open.